In the 1950s, Lykes Brothers ran the largest privately owned fleet flying the American flag, 54 cargo ships strong. 45 years later, it was gone. They lost because of one decision made in 1984, not because foreign ships simply got cheaper. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that decision was and why it destroyed a century-old company. Right now, that same trap, foreign competition, vanishing subsidies, no cushion left, is closing on America's shipping industry again. But first, Tampa's Ballast Point, where a doctor named Howell Lykes is loading cattle onto a schooner bound for Cuba. Everyone who has ever heard of Lykes Brothers blames the same thing for its death. Foreign competition. Cheaper ships, cheaper crews, cheaper everything sailing in from Asia and Europe and burying an old American shipping company that could not keep up. That explanation is not wrong. It is just too small. Foreign competition did not kill Lykes. It exposed something that had already been decided years earlier, quietly, inside paperwork nobody outside a law office ever read. But that's later. Right now it's still cattle, not container ships. Howell Lykes had trained as a doctor, then walked away from medicine to run a ranch north of Tampa. By the 1890s, he was shipping cattle out through Ballast Point to Cuba. His 7 sons grew up around that dock, and around 1899 they stopped renting space on other people's ships and bought one of their own, a battered 3-masted schooner just over 100 feet long, named after their father. Every major ship the company would ever build for the next century carried a Lykes family name. That's the part people skip. This didn't start as a shipping company. It started as a cattle business that got tired of paying someone else to move its own cows. The ships came second, the name came first. Here's where the story actually gets misunderstood. Everyone treats this as a shipping company collapse, one more freight line that couldn't compete. It wasn't really that. It was a story about what happens when a country decides it needs its own merchant ships for national security, builds an industry around that decision, and then slowly changes its mind. For most of the 20th century, the United States did not treat cargo shipping like a normal business. Congress needed American flag ships in case of war, so it paid companies like Lykes to build in expensive American shipyards, hire expensive American crews, and fly the American flag instead of a cheaper one. In exchange, it handed those companies subsidies, guaranteed cargo, and protection from the raw economics of the ocean. The country got a fleet it could call up in an emergency. The shipping lines got a business model that didn't have to survive on its own. Picture what that world actually looked like. Break bulk freighters, not the giant steel boxes you picture when you think cargo ship today, but old style vessels loaded one crate at a time by longshoremen in the holds. Gulf ports full of dock workers whose livelihoods were built around one company's sailing schedule. It made almost no sense as pure economics. It made sense as national security, a distinction that would eventually be erased. Lykes ran on that deal for generations, and it worked spectacularly. In the 1920s, it grew by swallowing smaller rivals whole, operating 67 ships by 1933. During the Second World War, the company ran as a government agent, operating up to 125 vessels and hauling 60 million tons of war cargo across oceans. German submarines were actively hunting. 22 of those ships never made it home. That's not a footnote. That's the reason the country trusted Lykes with everything that came after, because it had already proven it would sail into danger when asked. After the war, the company rebuilt itself into the largest privately owned cargo fleet under the American flag, running more than 50 ships totaling over 500,000 deadweight tons, confident enough to start selling shares publicly in 1958. Between 1960 and 1973, it replaced its entire fleet again with 41 new ships, including strange, oddly beautiful vessels called CBs with built-in elevators that could lift 1,000-ton barges straight out of the water. One writer spent months aboard a Lykes freighter in the late 1980s and turned the voyage into a book about the last days of the American merchant marine. Lykes wasn't background noise in that world. It was one of the last great names left standing in it, which is exactly why nobody saw the danger. The company that looked the most permanent was standing on ground that had already started to shift. Because the deal that built Lykes was never really about shipping. It was about politics. And by the late 1970s and the 1980s, American politics started losing interest in paying for it. The construction subsidies that let U.S. companies build in expensive American shipyards quietly died in 1981. No replacement, no transition plan, just gone. The operating subsidies were still around, but everyone in the industry knew they were on borrowed time in a Congress that increasingly saw them as a giveaway to an outdated industry. Foreign lines, faster, cheaper, running massive new container ships instead of old-style break-bulk freighters did not need any of that support. They were simply built to cost less. And Lykes wasn't watching this happen from a distance. It was watching its peers die from it, one at a time. United States Lines, the company that had basically invented modern container shipping, collapsed in 1986 with more than $2.5 billion in debt, the industry's biggest, most celebrated name imploding almost overnight. Moore McCormick, the other great American liner company, had already sold off its operations years earlier. Even Sealand, the market leader every subsidized American line measured itself against, started reflagging its own ships to foreign registries just to survive on price. If the strongest player in the industry needed a cheaper flag to compete, a smaller, older operator like Lykes never stood a chance running the old way. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They assume Lykes died because foreign container ships showed up and undercut it in the 1990s. But the real vulnerability was created almost a decade earlier, in a boardroom, not on a dock. In 1984, with its subsidies clearly shrinking and its old fleet aging out, Lykes did what looked like the responsible thing. It ordered a series of modern new ships to compete with the container lines eating its lunch. To pay for them, it borrowed the money in Japanese yen at rates that looked far better than anything available in dollars. On paper, this was smart. Cheaper financing, modern ships, a real shot at survival. That sounds like progress. It wasn't. It was a bet that the yen would stay roughly where it was against the dollar. It didn't. Through the mid-1980s, the dollar collapsed against the yen, losing something like half its value. Every payment Lykes owed on those ships got dramatically more expensive, year after year, no matter how the shipping business itself was performing. The company hadn't just bought ships, it had quietly signed up for a debt that grew heavier even when everything else stood still. This is the decision from the opening of this video, not a merger, not a scandal. A currency bet buried inside a financing plan made by people trying to save the company. That ended up being one of the things that broke it. Records from the bankruptcy case later showed Lykes still restructuring that same debt years afterward, renting back the very ships it had built to save itself. That's the move of a company that already knew years before the filing that the arithmetic no longer worked. One pressure like that, on its own, might have been survivable. Lykes didn't get one pressure. It got all of them, stacked on top of each other, arriving in the worst possible order. The subsidies kept eroding. The construction subsidy was already dead. The operating subsidy was scheduled to expire at the end of 1997, and Congress showed little appetite to renew it. Every year that passed, Lykes competed with less government support and more foreign competition, while its yen debt kept getting more expensive to service. The public saw a respected shipping company flying a proud American flag. The balance sheet saw a slow-motion emergency. Ownership added another layer of instability. The family had sold their steamship company into a larger corporate parent that merged with a Texas conglomerate in the late 1970s, then bought it back through a family entity in 1983, right before that fateful 1984 decision. By the early 1990s, the wider Lykes business empire was falling apart on multiple fronts. selling off banks, gas utilities, and meatpacking operations as an extended family of some 250 people pulled apart what their grandfathers had built. The steamship line wasn't failing in isolation. It was failing inside a family dismantling everything else it owned. Then, in December 1994, with the pressure already mounting, the company relocated its headquarters from New Orleans, where it had been based for over 70 years, to a tower in downtown Tampa. Not every job made the move. A quiet layoff nobody outside the industry noticed, months before the loud one. Less than a year later, it was over. On October 11th, 1995, Lykes Brothers steamship filed for Chapter 11 protection in federal court in Tampa. Court filings listed roughly $230 million in debts, against about $201 million in assets, owed to more than 1,000 creditors. The company still employed over 1,000 people worldwide. This was one of the largest collapses the American merchant marine had seen in a decade, and industry press was already calling Lykes the nation's third largest cargo ship operator, brought down by the exact subsidy system that had built it. Here's the part that made Lykes different from almost every other company that has ever filed for bankruptcy. It kept running, worldwide. The bankruptcy judge issued an injunction protecting Lykes ships anywhere on Earth from seizure, something the company's own lawyers said no shipping line had ever managed before. A Greek shipping company floated a $10 million lifeline. Ships kept sailing. Cargo kept moving. To an outside observer, nothing had really changed. But bankruptcy protection is not survival. It's a waiting room. 14 cargo ships were still flying the Lykes flag when the case began, 4 of them already reflagged foreign, a thinned-out shadow of the fleet that had once dominated the industry. In February 1997, the judge approved a winning bid from a Canadian shipping company, CP Ships, to buy Lykes' container operations outright. The reorganization plan was confirmed that April. By the end of July 1997, the sale was final, roughly $30 million for a company that, at its peak, had run one of the largest fleets on the planet. That number should stop you. A company that once operated 125 ships during the largest war in human history, that rebuilt itself into the biggest privately owned American fleet twice in 1 century, sold for less than the cost of a single modern container ship. The brand survived. The independent company did not. CP Ships kept the Lykes name alive for a while, running it as a subsidiary out of Tampa, employing hundreds of people under a logo with 100 years of history behind it. But in 2005, CP retired every one of its heritage brand names, folding Lykes into a single corporate identity. Months later, CP itself was bought by a German conglomerate and merged into Hapag-Lloyd. The name that had once flown over 100 American ships became a line item in an acquisition filing, then disappeared from shipping schedules entirely. Meanwhile, the actual ships had mostly vanished already. Some of the older freighters had been quietly handed to a government reserve fleet years before the bankruptcy, kept in mothballs for emergencies. Most of what remained was scrapped in the mid-1990s, cut apart for steel at breaking yards in India. The company didn't die in one dramatic moment. It died the way most collapsed transportation networks die, a little at a time, in places most people never look. This was not just a story about ships disappearing. It was a story about a place. Tampa had built its identity partly around that port, around the idea that one of the last great American shipping names called Florida home. When the company lost its independence, the docks didn't go empty overnight, but the sense of permanence did. The workers who had spent decades organizing their lives around Lykes schedules found themselves working for a foreign-owned subsidiary instead of an American institution their families had helped build. Think about what that actually meant for the people underneath the headline. A dock worker whose shift schedule had been built around Lykes sailings for 20 years, suddenly reporting to a parent company that had never heard of him. Merchant mariners who had sailed under the Lykes flag through the Gulf and the Atlantic for entire careers, finding their orders coming from a name that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. None of that shows up in a bankruptcy filing. All of it is what a bankruptcy filing actually does to people. By the time that subsidiary itself was absorbed, less than a decade later, The Tampa office that had grown to employ over 800 people locally was staring down deep cuts of its own, proof that even survival under new ownership was only ever temporary, not a resolution. One retrospective on the family that founded the company put it bluntly: the steamship line had been a matter of real pride. Ships literally named after Lykes' wives and daughters, and its loss was the most painful part of the entire family empire's collapse. It wasn't just a business failure to them. It was a name disappearing from something they'd built together for 100 years. Zoom out, and the Lykes story stops being about one shipping company at all. It's about what a country loses when it decides an industry no longer deserves protection without deciding what should replace it. The subsidies that built the American merchant marine were never really about profit. They were an insurance policy, a way of guaranteeing that if the country ever needed ships again, it would have crews and vessels ready, not scrambling to buy capacity from countries it might be at war with. When Congress let that policy lapse, companies like Lykes were competing without the one advantage that had let them survive for half a century. And that same trap is closing again, right now, on a much bigger scale. The United States builds less than 1% of the world's large commercial ships today. China builds roughly half. America's fleet of large ships trading internationally under its own flag numbers around 80, competing against a Chinese-flagged fleet of more than 5,000. In the spring of 2025, the federal government signed an executive order aimed at rebuilding American shipbuilding and the U.S. flag fleet, and a bipartisan bill moved through Congress with the same goal. Regulators followed with new fees on Chinese-built and Chinese-operated ships at American ports, and by early 2026, the White House had released a formal action plan for rebuilding a fleet it had let shrink for 40 years. In the middle of all that policy, one ship became a genuine headline. An aging container vessel, previously registered overseas, reflagged American at a U.S. port and celebrated by officials as the largest American flagged container ship on the water. The fact that a single reflagged ship counts as a milestone tells you exactly how far the fleet has fallen. It is almost exactly the mechanism that ended Lykes, a country that once protected its own shipping industry, quietly withdrew that protection, and only started reckoning with the cost decades later. So what actually destroyed Lykes Brothers? Not one crisis, not simply foreign competition, though that's the answer most people would guess. The company survived a world war and rebuilt itself from nothing. What it couldn't survive was a financing decision made in 1984, a currency bet buried inside a plan to modernize its fleet, landing at the exact moment the government support that had made American shipping viable for half a century was being quietly withdrawn. Either pressure alone might have been survivable. Together, they left no room for error, and error is exactly what a fractured, century-old family company could no longer afford. The Lykes name still exists in Florida today on cattle land and citrus groves the family never gave up. The very business that put doctors' sons on a boat to Cuba in the first place. It just doesn't exist on any ship anymore. The company that once sailed its own name across every ocean on Earth ended up right back where it started, on land, with the water gone quiet. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is about exactly this kind of story, the empires that looked permanent right up until they weren't. Consider subscribing if you want the next one. Did your family or your town or anyone you know ever depend on a Lykes ship, a Lykes paycheck, or that Tampa dock when it still meant something? Or did you only just hear the name for the first time tonight?